Question: have you purchased your first drone and you're a beginner drone pilot and you just want to go flying, don't you? Then listen up. In this video, I'm going to break down 30 of the biggest mistakes beginner drone pilots make from flying too high or even just forgetting about the basics. These bloopers and blunders could cost you your drone or even worse. So let's make sure you fly right. And don't worry, we've all made these mistakes. But the sooner you fix them, the more confident you'll be in the sky. So we're going to jump right in. Are you ready? Let's fly. So the first biggest mistake that you'll make as a new flyer is thinking that your drone is just like a toy. And it's easy to understand why someone may consider it in this way. Drones look like sleek, futuristic gadgets that resemble classic childhood toys. And this view will most likely change after a first-time flyer realizes just how expensive these drones can be. Think of these drones not as a toy, but as an instrument or a tool. It's very much like an expensive violin. As you play, you develop an appreciation for the music. And keep in mind that the FAA considers all drones as an SUAS, Small Unmanned Aircraft Systems. And speaking of the FAA, how about your sense of awareness for rules and regulations? The biggest mistake that beginner drone pilots make is not understanding that you have to take a test before you actually fly a drone. So if you're flying a drone recreationally, then you have to take an online test called the Trust Test. And if you're flying a drone commercially, then you have to take a test that allows you to be certified as a remote pilot, and that is the Part 107 exam. And both of these are legal requirements that a lot of first-time flyers are not aware of. Taking either one of these tests before you fly will allow you to avoid making big mistakes. The third is about identification. If you're flying a drone recreationally for fun, you do not need to register your drone if and only if it is under 250 grams. And some of the biggest mistakes that beginner drone pilots always make is flying a drone that is over 250 grams, not registering it, and not displaying the serial number of that aircraft on the side of the drone. Avoiding this big mistake will not only keep you out of trouble, but will also prevent you from having to pay costly fines. Number 4, one of the biggest mistakes is lack of preparation, not having a before-flight checklist. Now, this may seem tedious for a first-time drone pilot, but it's absolutely essential. A pre-flight checklist allows you to make sure that the propellers are not damaged, the battery level is adequate, the firmware is updated, the camera gimbal and the compass are both calibrated, and the remote control is functional and transmitting. These are critical points that beginner drone pilots just don't do. And what you'll find is by following these procedures will allow you to avoid making the biggest mistakes. Number 5 is the safeguard of removing the gimbal guard before you actually power on your drone. Now, it's so amazing that the same thing that has been provided to protect your gimbal from damage is the same exact thing that will cause the most amount of damage on your camera gimbal. You see, if you power on your drone and the gimbal guard has not been removed, you will more than likely burn out the gimbal motors, or you will cause the gimbal to be thrown out of alignment permanently. Take this to heart. This is one of the biggest mistakes that not only beginner pilots make, but also experienced drone pilots make. So this is what I recommend. Before you insert a battery into any drone, remove the gimbal guard first. The next one is about the sequence of powering on your devices. So if I asked you this question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? What would be your answer? If you approach this scientifically, then the egg should come first. But if you approach this philosophically, then the chicken should come first. But if I ask the question of drone versus remote as to which gets powered on first, then this is purely scientific because the egg is the remote and the chicken is the drone. The remote control needs to be powered on first, and this is the biggest mistake that beginner pilots make, because if you power on the drone first, it will have a tendency to search for another signal, and you don't want your drone to simply fly away before you had the ability to take control. The next one is about revision, firmware updates. Beginner drone pilots always make the mistake of not updating their firmware before they have actually gone out to fly their drones. Once you're out in the field, you will not be able to perform a firmware update very easily, so it's important that when you're connected to an adequate source of Wi-Fi, that you update both the drone and the remote before you actually leave to go out and fly. This will save you not only a lot of time, but will also preserve your battery power as well. Number 8, if you forget to extend the antennas on your remote control, especially if you're flying a DJI drone, it can severely impact your flight experience. The concerns here are reduced range, intermittent connection, increased interference. And the last one that I mentioned is the biggest concern, because imagine this: if your drone does not see your signal that's being transmitted as being the strongest, then another signal will take over and interfere with that process, so that way you will have a loss of control. And a loss of control could lead to anything such as an automatic return to home, losing your video feed, or even a crash potential, worse, a flyaway. And by saying that, not extending the antennas on your remote control is the biggest mistake that a beginner drone pilot will make. Number 9 is one of the most critical safety issues, and that is not setting your return to home altitude. And why is this so important? It's because most drones, when you press the return to home button, the drone will climb to a preset altitude to avoid hitting any objects on the way back home. And if you unknowingly have the altitude set above the legal limit, well, guess what? You may find your drone crashing into a manned aircraft that just so happened to be flying above you. Or the other scenario is if you have your return to home altitude set too low. You could risk crashing into a building, a power line, a tree, or even a mountain. First-time flyers do not think about this critical rule, so it's important to understand that when it's time for the drone to return home, that the altitude is set high enough so it will avoid running into any obstacles or structures. And just on a bonus tip, if you don't check the return to home altitude on your remote control, it's probably because you're thinking that the drone is going to return safely automatically, and that is not always the case. So avoid making this big mistake and set the return to home altitude before you fly. Number 10, and this is a big one, is thinking that your return to home feature will work in any given situation under any conditions. The answer to that hypothetical question is no, it will not. A perfect case in point example is if you were standing on top of a mountain and the drone is flying in a canyon or a valley below you. The return to home function may cause the drone to behave unexpectedly or even fail to initiate the process of returning to home. Let me explain the return to home logic so you'll avoid making this big mistake. Most drones calculate altitude based on where the drone took off at point 0. If the drone is below that point, it will register as a negative altitude. Some drones, especially DJI drones, have a built-in logic board that does not trigger return to home climb if the drone is within a short horizontal distance, meaning that if the drone is under 50 meters or below 50 meters from where the home point is, the return to home feature will not work. This is a critical glitch that even the most experienced pilots don't know about. The drone is entering into a fail-safe hover mode, so instead of the drone climbing to the present return to home altitude, the drone will simply hover and wait for a manual input, and that means you need to take your left thumb and push the left stick forward so the drone will climb to an appropriate altitude and then be able to return to home. This is one of the biggest mistakes that drone pilots make when the drone is at a negative altitude. And if these tips are helpful for you, then hit that like and subscribe button, and let's move on to the next one. Now, since I just touched on pushing the left stick forward on your remote control, this will lead me into the next big mistake, and that's not taking the time to learn your remote control. Let me ask you, do you remember driving your car for the first time? Or have you ever ridden a motorcycle for the first time and you really didn't know how everything worked? That's a pretty dangerous proposition, don't you think? Well, flying a drone is very similar to that. You need to learn how to control and manipulate the drone first before you fly. And it sounds counterintuitive the way I said that, because you have to put the drone in the air in order to learn how to fly it, right? But that's not what I mean. What I mean is that before you actually take off, you need to become familiar with what the controls can do on the remote controller. It's emotional impulsiveness that drives us to be impatient when it comes to flying a drone, but you have to take the time to learn the remote control first before you fly. Number 12 is the takeoff direction of your drone. Now, this is the biggest mistake that I have made in the beginning when I first started flying. My first drone many years ago was a DJI Phantom 4, and you all know what this legendary drone looks like. You can't tell what's front to back. Well, that is unless you pay attention to where the camera gimbal is, or if you're looking at the lights on the back of the battery. But the point is that all 4 sides of the drone are identical. So being transparent with you, I made the mistake of having the drone facing me when I was taking off. And as I impulsively and immaturely pushed the right stick to the right, the drone went left. And that big mistake was my first flight that caused the drone to crash into a tree. Fortunately for me, only one of the landing legs were damaged. But I learned a very powerful lesson. Always have the drone facing away from you when you take off. Number 13, making the adjustments to your camera settings and white balance. Now, the reason why most beginner drone pilots don't bother with this is simply because they just don't know anything about it. For most people, the human brain is programmed to avoid anything that seems to be complicated. But the biggest mistake that you can make is thinking that this is complicated. It's extremely easy to make small adjustments to your camera settings and turn your white balance from auto to manual. By doing this, you'll be able to capture photos and videos with the best quality possible. And isn't that why you decided to fly a drone in the first place? Let's move to the next one. And this has to do with storage, inserting your micro SD card. Now, this is the biggest mistake that all new drone pilots make. You've launched your drone, you've got it 200 feet up in the air, and you've pushed it out to 1,000 feet. And you've got some beautiful scenery just before the sun is about to set, and all of a sudden you realize that you didn't insert the SD card into the slot. So now you have to bring the drone all the way back, land the drone, go get the SD card, insert the SD card, take off again, get up to 200 feet, and push it out to another 1,000 feet. And before you can do all of that, the sun has already set, you can't fly anymore, and guess what? You're done. That pre-flight checklist that I mentioned earlier, can you see now why that is so important? The biggest mistake that a new pilot will make is not making sure that an SD card is inserted before takeoff. Number 15, if you have an SD card that's already inserted, well, you're going to want to be able to record information or data onto that SD card, right? But what good is it if you forget to hit the record button while you're up in the air? This is one of the biggest mistakes that new pilots make because they're so entrenched and so involved in trying to actually fly the drone that they forget to actually hit the record button when they're flying. And most of the time, the drone has been flying for 30 or 40 minutes. They bring the drone back home, land the drone, take the SD card out, put it into the computer, and they see that nothing has been recorded, and then they remember that they never pressed the record button. This could be heartbreaking and sometimes even embarrassing if you have a client that you were working with and they're expecting the drone footage that you captured to retain their long-lasting memorable moments. So regardless of whether you're flying recreationally or if you're flying on a commercial job, make sure that you press that record button so you won't have to make a big mistake. Number 16, flying in an unpopulated area. Now, most new drone pilots are not aware of the fact that you can't fly over people. And this could be the biggest mistake because if you just happen to injure someone and they end up going to the hospital, then more than likely you're probably also not aware of the fact that you need to report this to the FAA within 10 days. So the recommendation here is to fly in an unpopulated area where there aren't too many people, or what's termed as sparsely populated area, and then you'll be able to fly around without having to worry about any other people or any property that you may damage. Number 17 is proximity, flying too close to objects or structures. Now, new pilots don't have the intuitive perception of knowing how close they actually are to a certain object, especially when you're flying a drone. This is very much like when you compare this to an experienced motorcycle rider who knows that the speed and the rate that they're going, that they'll be able to make a sharp turn. Well, as a new rider or a new flyer, you don't have that sort of experience. So that way, your perception of how close you are to something is much different when you're a beginner pilot than if you've been experienced in flying drones. An experienced flyer will know how to manipulate the remote controls to have a much better reactionary response when they're close to an object, rather than a new beginner pilot that does not have the experience and knowing how to manipulate the drone away from an object. This is the biggest mistake that beginner drone pilots make, is that they fly too close to an object or a structure. Number 18 is perception of flying over water. Now, the biggest mistake that a beginner drone pilot will make is thinking that they can fly very close to the surface of the water, whereas the closer you are to the surface of the water, the more chance you have of sinking the drone. This is because the drone itself has no perception of altitude when it's flying over water. It has no understanding that the surface of the water, being transparent, is considered as being the same as the surface on land. It has no understanding of that, so therefore it will consider the bottom of the ocean or the bottom of the lake being the surface, and you may sink the drone faster than when you started flying it. Beginner drone pilots make the biggest mistake of not understanding that when you're flying over water, you need to be at a certain altitude, so therefore the drone does not get confused. Number 19 is about legal limits, flying way too high above the legal limit, which is set at 400 feet AGL. Most beginner pilots either don't know or they forget that you must stay at or below that altitude. You see, the instinctive nature of human beings is to say that since I paid so much money for the drone, that I should be able to fly as high as I possibly can. And that is the one biggest mistake that will get you into the most amount of trouble, because if you so happen to crash into a manned aircraft, well, don't worry about just losing your drone. You're going to end up losing everything else also. Number 20 is about authorization, and this is a big one because most beginner pilots have absolutely no clue of what class of airspace they're flying in. When you launch your drone, when you take off, as soon as that drone is in the air, regardless of what the altitude is, you are going to be flying in a particular class of airspace. And if you don't know what that airspace is, you may be setting yourself up for big trouble, because even if the drone is 2 feet off the ground, you still have to get clearance and authorization from air traffic control if you're flying in controlled airspace. So if you want to avoid making a big mistake, find out what class of airspace you're in first before you fly. Number 21 is about restrictions. Now, if you're flying in a park, that can seem fun, and you have trails and you have rivers and you have lakes, but the problem is that if you don't know as a first-time flyer that a U.S. national park is restricted, then you're setting yourself up for some big trouble. Violations that result in you flying in a U.S. national park could mean a misdemeanor with fines up to $5,000 or even 6 months in prison. So when you see the signs that say national parks or NPS lands, don't fly there, because you may be making a big mistake by doing it. Number 22 is limitations, flying beyond your skill level. This is the biggest mistake that new drone pilots make. And the reason for that is because you're so excited about trying to fly the drone and you want to show off that you allow your enthusiastic energy to take over your inexperience. It's very easy to show off in the beginning, but if you lose your drone, then you may not have a drone to show, period. Number 23 is about visibility. Now, as a new drone pilot, it's very easy to push the limits. I mean, to go as far as you possibly can, or to fly as far as you possibly can fly. The rule of thumb here is that you should fly your drone, but you should always be able to maintain visual line of sight, meaning that when you're flying your drone, either too far or too high, that as soon as you lose visual sight, visual references, that means that you've gone too far. And even though you can see where you are on your remote display, you may not be able to see the power line or the trees that your drone is about to crash into. Not to mention that the FAA will not allow you to fly beyond visual line of sight unless you have a waiver. Another big mistake that new drone pilots make is the control station location. Now, wherever the drone takes off from, that will be the established home point location. Now, as you're flying, wherever it is that you are, no matter how high or how far, when you hit the return to home button, the drone will return to the original takeoff location. But what do you think happens when you were flying the drone and you moved away from the original home point location? Now let's say you're about 300 yards away from where the drone originally took off. So if you hit the return to home button, the drone will not return to where you are now. The drone is going to return to where it originally took off 300 yards away. So the biggest mistake that new pilots make is that they do not update their home point location as they're moving from place to place. So that way the drone knows exactly where to return, as the remote control and the pilot are established at a new home point location. Number 25, instability. This is about flying in windy weather conditions. Now, if you can imagine holding an egg on a tablespoon and you're standing on top of a car that's going over bumpy terrain, this is what's happening to your camera gimbal on a windy day. It's trying to maintain a level of stability in the image, but it's very difficult because the wind is moving the drone so much that the video will start looking very very jerky and bouncy. Experienced drone pilots always look for the most optimal weather conditions before they fly their drones. Number 26, consumption, and this has to do with not paying attention to the battery level indicator. The biggest mistake you can make is flying your drone out and not having enough battery level to bring it back home. Beginners get so focused on flying and capturing cool footage that they forget to understand that monitoring the battery level throughout the flight is extremely important, and that they should start returning the drone home no later than 25 to 30% of the charge remaining in the battery. 27 is about acknowledgement, and this is about when you ignore the warning prompts on your remote or your remote app. Beginner drone pilots don't usually understand what those warning sounds actually mean, and these are critical system messages that could indicate a serious problem. Ignoring these sounds can lead to a crash or flyaway, and beginners don't usually understand these prompts, so they dismiss them too quickly. It's important to understand what these warning signs actually mean, so if you're not sure, then land the drone immediately and determine what the problem was before continuing your flight. Number 28 is another big mistake, putting your remote control down while your drone is in flight. It sounds crazy, but some new pilots literally set their remote controls down to grab something such as their phone. And why is this a big mistake? Because even if the drone is hovering, you should never leave it unattended. This is a dangerous proposition because suppose the remote falls over and lands on one of the sticks and the drone just flies into either a person or damages some property. Or even worse, it climbs above the legal altitude and crashes into a manned aircraft. This is more than just a big mistake. This is a potential disaster. So do yourself a favor, always keep the remote controls in your hand and maintain full control until the drone has landed and the motors are turned off. Number 29 is using a takeoff and landing pad. Now you can spot a beginner pilot very quickly because they usually will not have a landing pad and they'll be taking off on grass, gravel, sand, uneven pavements, and they have no understanding that the debris from the dirt, sand, and small rocks will get sucked into the motors or the gimbal. Using a landing pad or even a mat from your car will protect your drone and give it a visible target, and you'll be able to take off and land your drone safely, so that way you'll avoid any damage to your propellers or your gimbals or your drone. And number 30 is probably the most common, biggest mistake that beginner pilots make, and that is flying your drone indoors without having adequate experience. Indoor flights seem as though they're safe, right? But here's the problem. The drone will not have direct line of sight for GPS signals, and because of that, you'll notice that the drone will drift and behave unpredictably. In a tight space where you have walls and furniture and people, you don't want to fly a drone that has propeller blades that can cause some serious damage. When you fly a drone indoors, you increase the risk of crashing into a wall, a ceiling, pets, people. It's better to avoid flying indoors unless it's absolutely necessary or you have a lot of experience flying a drone. And I want you to remember this: everyone makes mistakes and everyone has crashed a drone. So be honest and post a comment. How many of these mistakes have you made? Share your information in the comments below so we can all learn from this. Smash that like button if you've learned something new today, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. I'll have more tips and tutorials coming for you, more updates, and until then, I'll see you all on the next video.